What if I told you that Carl Sagan, the man who filled millions of hearts with wonder about the cosmos, who showed us the beauty of our pale blue dot, who inspired generations to reach for the stars, harbored a secret fear so profound that it kept him awake at night in his final years? What if I told you that behind his gentle smile and poetic voice lay a terrifying vision of humanity's potential end, not from asteroids, alien invasion, or the eventual death of our sun billions of years from now, but from something far more immediate and far more chilling: our own spectacular failure as a species to outgrow the very instincts that once ensured our survival? Right now, as you watch this video in what Sagan predicted would be humanity's most dangerous hour, you are witnessing the unfolding of the exact scenario that made this brilliant scientist's blood run cold. Imagine the moment when humanity's greatest achievement becomes its greatest curse, when the same intelligence that unlocked the secrets of the atom and reached toward other worlds turns against itself with the efficiency of a cosmic catastrophe. Picture a civilization that develops godlike powers over matter and energy while retaining the tribal psychology of creatures who evolved to compete for limited resources on an apparently infinite continent. Envision a species that learns to split atoms and splice genes while losing the ability to distinguish between truth and comfortable lies, between evidence and wishful thinking, between the long-term survival of their children and the short-term convenience of their choices. This isn't science fiction. This is the terrifying prediction that haunted Carl Sagan's final decade, a prediction so disturbing that he spent his remaining years desperately trying to warn humanity about the cliff we were approaching. He saw something that most people still refuse to acknowledge. We have become the first species in Earth's history to possess the power to end not just our own existence, but the entire 4-billion-year experiment in consciousness that produced us, and we are wielding that power with the wisdom of frightened children. Dr. Carl Edward Sagan understood extinction intimately, not as an abstract concept, but as a cosmic constant. He knew that extinction is the rule in the universe, survival the exception. 99.9% of all species that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct. He had studied the fossil record, traced the rise and fall of countless life forms, witnessed through geological evidence how quickly complex ecosystems can collapse when conditions change beyond their adaptive capacity. But what terrified him wasn't natural extinction. It was the prospect of conscious extinction, the possibility that intelligence itself might be an evolutionary dead end. In the 1980s, Sagan and his colleagues developed what became known as the nuclear winter theory, a prediction so horrifying that it changed the entire debate about nuclear weapons. They calculated that even a relatively small nuclear exchange, just 100 megatons of explosions, a fraction of the world's nuclear arsenal, could trigger a global climate catastrophe that would plunge Earth into a deadly winter lasting months or years. Temperatures would drop by 15 to 25 degrees Celsius, crops would fail worldwide, and most of humanity would starve in darkness. The possibility of complete human extinction, they concluded, cannot be excluded. But as terrifying as nuclear winter was, Sagan realized it was just one symptom of a deeper problem that threatened humanity's long-term survival. The same species that could create weapons capable of ending civilization was increasingly unable to think rationally about the consequences of using those weapons. The same minds that could unlock the secrets of nuclear fusion were falling prey to superstition, pseudoscience, and the kind of magical thinking that had been understandable in pre-scientific societies but was potentially suicidal in a technological civilization. By 1995, when Sagan published The Demon-Haunted World, his most terrifying prediction had crystallized into a vision so chilling that it still haunts readers today. He foresaw a future America, and by extension, a future world, where awesome technological powers would be concentrated in the hands of very few people, while the general population lost the ability to understand or question those technologies. He predicted a society where critical thinking would decline to the point where people could no longer distinguish between what feels good and what is true, where scientific literacy would erode so completely that democratic decision-making about technological issues would become impossible. "I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time," Sagan wrote, "when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the key manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few, and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues. He envisioned a society where people would clutch crystals and nervously consult horoscopes while sliding, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. This wasn't just social commentary. This was an existential warning about the conditions that precede civilizational collapse. Sagan understood that any species advanced enough to develop nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and planetary-scale environmental manipulation faces what he called the technological adolescence test. Could they develop wisdom fast enough to keep pace with their growing power? Could they learn to think in geological timescales and cosmic perspectives before their short-term thinking destroyed the conditions that made their existence possible? The terrifying answer, Sagan realized, was probably not. He had seen how tobacco companies pioneered techniques for manufacturing doubt about scientific evidence in the 1950s and 1960s. He watched as these same methods were applied to acid rain, ozone depletion, and climate change with devastating effectiveness. He observed how economic interests could manipulate public opinion to reject overwhelming scientific consensus when that consensus threatened short-term profits. He witnessed the rise of media systems that prioritized entertainment over education, sensationalism over substance, comfort over truth. What made this prediction so terrifying wasn't just the prospect of human extinction, it was the prospect of conscious, avoidable, completely unnecessary extinction. Unlike the dinosaurs who were wiped out by forces beyond their control, humanity would end its own story, through willful ignorance, through the deliberate choice of convenient lies over inconvenient truths, through the systematic rejection of the very scientific thinking that had given them the power to destroy themselves. Sagan saw the signs everywhere: declining educational standards, growing distrust of expertise, the rise of conspiracy theories, the politicization of scientific facts, the increasing influence of corporate interests on public policy, the fragmentation of shared sources of information, the growing gap between technological complexity and public understanding. Each trend by itself was troubling. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed towards civilizational suicide on a cosmic scale. The most chilling aspect of Sagan's prediction was its timeline. He wasn't talking about threats centuries in the future. He was describing changes that were already underway in his lifetime, trends that would reach critical mass within decades. He saw a narrow window of opportunity for humanity to develop the cosmic perspective and scientific literacy needed to navigate the challenges ahead, and he watched that window closing with each passing year. The genius and terror of Carl Sagan's prediction lay not in its speculation about distant possibilities, but in its surgical precision about immediate realities that most people couldn't or wouldn't see. He understood something that remains invisible to most of us even today. We are living through the most dangerous transition in the history of life on Earth, the moment when a species gains the power to alter planetary systems faster than it can understand the consequences of those alterations. This transition has never happened before in 4 billion years of evolution, and Sagan realized that the odds of successfully navigating it were terrifyingly slim. What made his prediction so uniquely horrifying was his recognition that extinction wouldn't come from external threats, asteroids, supervolcanic eruptions, or stellar catastrophes, but from internal failures of wisdom, judgment, and collective intelligence. He foresaw a future where humanity would possess technologies powerful enough to reshape the atmosphere, alter the genetic code of life itself, and create artificial minds that might surpass human intelligence, while simultaneously losing the capacity for the kind of long-term thinking that such technologies demand. It was like watching a toddler gain access to loaded weapons while losing the ability to understand cause and effect. Sagan's climate change warnings from the 1980s exemplified this pattern perfectly. He testified before Congress in 1985 about the greenhouse effect, explaining with characteristic clarity how burning fossil fuels would trap heat in Earth's atmosphere and destabilize the climate systems that had remained stable throughout human history. He presented evidence, showed projections, and outlined the physics behind what was happening. The science was clear, the dangers were real, and the solutions were technically feasible. Yet he watched in horror as economic interests systematically undermined public understanding of climate science, using the same doubt manufacturing techniques that had been perfected by the tobacco industry. This was the pattern that terrified him most. Not that humans were incapable of understanding complex challenges, but that they could be systematically prevented from understanding them by interests that profited from confusion and delay. He saw how pseudoscience could be weaponized against real science, how false balance in media coverage could create the illusion of scientific controversy where none existed, how political polarization could transform empirical questions into tribal identities. The very democracy that had created the conditions for scientific progress was being turned against scientific thinking. But the climate crisis was just one example of a broader phenomenon that Sagan recognized as potentially terminal for technological civilizations. Every major challenge facing an advanced species, nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, planetary engineering, requires exactly the kind of careful, evidence-based, long-term thinking that consumer cultures systematically discourage. These challenges demand that people think beyond election cycles, beyond quarterly profit reports, beyond the immediate gratification that drives market economies. They require what Sagan called deep-time thinking, the ability to consider consequences that might not manifest for decades or centuries. Yet the same economic and political systems that had enabled rapid technological development seemed incapable of generating the wisdom to use those technologies safely. Short-term thinking that had once been merely inefficient now threatened to become suicidal. The quarterly profit mentality that had driven innovation was now driving civilization toward the kind of mistakes that species don't recover from. Sagan realized that humanity was trapped in a kind of evolutionary mismatch. Brains, shaped by millions of years of small group survival, were making decisions about planetary-scale technologies they couldn't intuitively comprehend. The nuclear winter calculations had shown him just how thin the margins for error had become. Even relatively small mistakes with powerful technologies could trigger cascading effects that would end human civilization. Climate change demonstrated how seemingly benign activities, burning fossil fuels for energy, could accumulate over decades into planetary-scale disruptions. Future technologies would likely be even more powerful and potentially more dangerous. Genetic engineering could create organisms that might devastate ecosystems. Artificial intelligence could develop capabilities that its creators couldn't predict or control. Nanotechnology could enable the creation of self-replicating systems that might consume entire biospheres. Each of these technologies, properly managed, could benefit humanity enormously, but properly managed required exactly the kind of scientific literacy, long-term thinking, and global cooperation that Sagan saw disappearing from public discourse. He watched as educational systems failed to produce citizens capable of understanding the basics of the technologies their lives depended on. He observed how media systems rewarded sensationalism over accuracy, how political systems punished nuance in favor of simple answers to complex problems, how economic systems prioritized immediate profits over long-term sustainability. The result was a civilization increasingly characterized by what Sagan called a combustible mixture of ignorance and power. Technologies that required deep understanding were being deployed by societies that actively discouraged deep understanding. Democratic decisions about technological policies were being made by populations that lacked the scientific literacy to evaluate those policies meaningfully. The feedback loops between technological development and social wisdom were breaking down at exactly the moment when they needed to be strongest. Sagan's most terrifying insight was that this pattern might be universal, explaining why the galaxy seemed so quiet, despite containing billions of potentially habitable worlds. Perhaps intelligence was not rare in the universe. Perhaps the transition from intelligence to wisdom was rare. Perhaps most technological civilizations destroyed themselves during their adolescent phase, when their power outgrew their judgment, when their capabilities exceeded their wisdom, when their reach surpassed their grasp of consequences. This was the great filter that haunted Sagan's imagination, not a single catastrophic event, but a phase transition that required species to fundamentally transform their decision-making processes, their economic systems, their educational priorities, and their cultural values within a very narrow window of time. Species that failed this transition would join the vast silence of the cosmos, their radio signals fading into background noise, their cities crumbling back into geological time, their experiments in consciousness adding another cautionary tale to the universe's collection of failed civilizations. If this cosmic perspective resonates with something deep within you, if you recognize that understanding our place in the universe isn't just fascinating but essential for our survival as a species, then you've discovered exactly what this channel is about. We're not just exploring scientific concepts, we're cultivating the kind of cosmic awareness that Carl Sagan believed might be humanity's best hope for passing the great test that faces every technological civilization. When you subscribe, you're joining a community of people who understand that science isn't just about accumulating facts, but about developing the wisdom to use knowledge responsibly in a universe where mistakes can have cosmic consequences. Share in the comments. What aspects of Sagan's terrifying prediction do you see manifesting in today's world? What gives you hope that we might still develop the cosmic perspective needed to navigate the challenges ahead? The most haunting aspect of Carl Sagan's terrifying prediction about humanity's end wasn't the specific mechanisms he identified, nuclear winter, climate change, scientific illiteracy, but his recognition that these were symptoms of a deeper problem that might be built into the nature of intelligence itself. He came to understand that consciousness, for all its magnificent achievements, might carry within it the seeds of its own destruction, that the same cognitive biases that had helped our ancestors survive in small groups might prove fatal when applied to global-scale technological decisions in a connected world. Sagan observed what cognitive scientists now call the availability heuristic, our tendency to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily we can remember examples of them happening. This mental shortcut had served our ancestors well when most threats were immediate and local. The rustle in nearby bushes was more likely to be a predator than distant thunder was to signal a drought. But in a technological civilization, the most dangerous threats are often precisely those that are hardest to imagine, that have never happened before, that unfold too slowly or on too large a scale for human intuition to grasp. Climate change exemplified this cognitive trap perfectly. The atmosphere doesn't provide immediate feedback when we burn fossil fuels. There's no pain signal, no obvious cause and effect relationship, no dramatic moment when the consequences become undeniable. Instead, the effects accumulate slowly over decades, in ways that require scientific instruments to detect and complex models to understand. By the time the consequences become obvious to casual observation, the momentum built into the system makes them nearly impossible to reverse. Sagan realized that this mismatch between human psychology and technological reality could be fatal for any civilization that developed global-scale technologies before developing global-scale thinking. But the problem went deeper than individual cognitive limitations. Sagan saw how collective decision-making systems, democracies, markets, corporations, governments, were all optimized for short-term responses to immediate pressures, not for long-term management of slowly developing existential risks. Democratic politicians were rewarded for promising immediate benefits, not for investing in long-term survival. Market systems were structured to maximize quarterly profits, not to minimize century-scale risks. Corporate leaders were incentivized to externalize costs onto future generations, rather than to internalize them into current decisions. These systems had worked reasonably well when human impacts were local and reversible, when mistakes affected only immediate communities and could be corrected through trial and error. But as human technologies gained planetary reach, the consequences of systemic failures became global and potentially irreversible. The same decision-making structures that had enabled rapid technological development were proving inadequate for managing the risks that rapid technological development created. Sagan's nuclear winter research had revealed just how quickly modern technologies could transform local conflicts into planetary catastrophes. A nuclear exchange between any two powers could affect global climate patterns, destroying agriculture and causing famines on continents thousands of miles from the conflict zones. Similarly, genetic engineering mistakes could create organisms that might spread globally before their dangers became apparent. Artificial intelligence systems could develop capabilities that exceeded human ability to predict or control their behavior. Each new technology seemed to reduce the time between human error and species-threatening consequences. The terrifying mathematics of technological risk became clear to Sagan through his study of extinction probabilities. If a civilization faces a 1% chance of extinction each year from various technological risks, nuclear war, climate change, bioengineering accidents, artificial intelligence mishaps, then its expected survival time is only about 70 years. If the annual risk is 0.5%, survival time extends to about 140 years. Only if civilizations can reduce their annual extinction risk to 0.1% do they have reasonable prospects for millennial survival, and only if they can push it below 0.01% can they hope to survive long enough to become truly spacefaring species. These calculations suggested that the window for developing cosmic perspective and technological wisdom was far narrower than most people imagined. Civilizations didn't have centuries or millennia to gradually develop wisdom. They had decades, perhaps less, to fundamentally transform their decision-making processes, their educational systems, their economic structures, and their political institutions. The transition from planetary to cosmic thinking had to happen within a single generation or two, or it might not happen at all. This timeline pressure explained why Sagan became increasingly urgent in his final years about promoting scientific literacy and critical thinking. He understood that humanity was in a race between growing technological power and growing technological wisdom, and that the outcome of this race would determine not just human survival, but the survival of Earth's entire 4-billion-year experiment in biological complexity. If humans failed the test, they would likely take most of Earth's biosphere with them, ending not just their own story, but the stories of millions of other species that had no choice in humanity's technological decisions. Sagan's most chilling realization was that this pattern, intelligence developing rapidly but wisdom developing slowly, might be universal, explaining the Fermi paradox. Why the galaxy seemed so quiet, despite containing billions of potentially habitable worlds. Perhaps intelligence was common in the universe, but wise intelligence was vanishingly rare. Perhaps most technological civilizations destroyed themselves during their adolescent phase, when they gained godlike powers over matter and energy, but retained childlike approaches to risk assessment and long-term planning. The archaeological record of Earth supported this disturbing possibility. Previous civilizations had collapsed when they exceeded the carrying capacity of their local environments, or when they failed to adapt to changing conditions. But those collapses had been local and temporary. Other human populations survived to learn from their predecessors' mistakes. A technological civilization's collapse would likely be global and permanent, eliminating not just the civilization, but the entire species that created it, along with most other complex life forms that shared its planet. Yet Sagan refused to surrender to despair, even as he contemplated these cosmic scales of potential failure. He understood that awareness of danger was the first step toward avoiding it, that species capable of understanding their situation were also capable of changing it. The same intelligence that created existential risks could potentially develop solutions to those risks, but only if it was coupled with wisdom, humility, and the kind of long-term thinking that he called cosmic perspective. As we stand at the precipice that Carl Sagan identified decades ago, staring into the abyss of his most terrifying prediction, we face a moment that is simultaneously the most dangerous and the most hopeful in human history. Yes, we have developed the power to end civilization through nuclear war, climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or any number of other technological pathways. Yes, we have systematically undermined the scientific literacy and critical thinking skills that we need to navigate these challenges safely. Yes, we have created economic and political systems that reward short-term thinking while punishing the kind of long-term planning that survival requires. But we have also become the first generation in history to fully understand these dangers, and understanding is the prerequisite for wisdom. Sagan's terrifying prediction was never meant to be a prophecy of inevitable doom. It was meant to be a warning that could help us change course before it was too late. He believed deeply in human potential, in our capacity for reason, wonder, and wisdom when given proper education and encouragement. He spent his life showing that scientific understanding didn't diminish human significance, but revealed it on the grandest possible scale, that cosmic perspective didn't make us smaller, but helped us understand our true responsibilities as conscious participants in the universe's ongoing evolution. The key insight from Sagan's work is that survival in the technological age requires a fundamental shift in how we think about risk, time, and our relationship to the natural world. We must learn to think like cosmic citizens rather than tribal competitors, to consider consequences that extend beyond our immediate self-interest, to value truth over comfort and evidence over ideology. This isn't just moral advice. It's practical guidance for species survival in an era when local mistakes can have global consequences. Consider the extraordinary developments that have occurred since Sagan issued his warnings. We have developed renewable energy technologies that could power human civilization without destabilizing the climate. We have created global communication networks that could enable unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. We have advanced our understanding of complex systems to the point where we can model and potentially manage planetary-scale processes. We have even begun to develop artificial intelligence systems that could help us solve problems too complex for unaugmented human minds to grasp. Each of these developments offers hope that we might still pass the great test that Sagan believed every technological civilization must face. But passing this test requires more than just technological solutions. It requires what he called a transformation of human consciousness, a shift from seeing ourselves as separate from nature to understanding ourselves as nature becoming self-aware and taking responsibility for its own future. This transformation is already beginning to happen in ways that give reason for optimism. Young people around the world are demonstrating unprecedented awareness of global challenges and willingness to think beyond national boundaries and tribal identities. Scientists are increasingly engaging with public policy and education, recognizing their responsibility to help society understand and respond to technological risks. Entrepreneurs are creating technologies specifically designed to solve global problems rather than just to maximize profits. Even some political and business leaders are beginning to recognize that short-term thinking is ultimately self-defeating in an interconnected world. But the window of opportunity that Sagan identified remains narrow and continues to close with each passing year. The next few decades will be crucial in determining whether humanity develops the cosmic perspective and technological wisdom needed to navigate the challenges ahead, or whether we join the hypothetical millions of civilizations that may have failed this same test elsewhere in the galaxy. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on choices that each of us makes, individually and collectively, about how we want to live and what kind of future we want to create. The cosmic perspective that Sagan championed offers both the motivation and the framework for making these choices wisely. When you understand that you are made of atoms forged in stellar furnaces, that you are part of an evolutionary process that has been unfolding for billions of years, that you are the universe's way of understanding itself, the petty concerns that divide human tribes begin to seem trivial compared to our shared responsibility as conscious beings in a vast and mostly unconscious cosmos. This perspective doesn't eliminate the need for hard work, difficult decisions, and sometimes painful sacrifices in the short term. Transitioning to sustainable energy systems, developing safe artificial intelligence, preventing nuclear proliferation, and addressing climate change will all require enormous effort and resources. But cosmic perspective provides the motivation for undertaking these efforts and the framework for making the decisions that these challenges demand. It reminds us that we are not just working for ourselves or even for our immediate descendants, but for the continuation of consciousness itself in this corner of the universe. Sagan's most terrifying prediction may still come to pass. We may indeed fail the test of technological adolescence that faces every intelligent species. But his prediction was also a gift, a warning that could help us avoid the fate he feared. By understanding the dangers we face, by developing the scientific literacy and critical thinking skills we need to respond to those dangers, by cultivating the cosmic perspective that reveals our true place and responsibility in the universe, we can still choose a different path. The universe is counting on us to get this right, not because we are the center of creation, but because we may be consciousness itself, trying to ensure its own survival and continued evolution. Every choice you make from this cosmic perspective matters, because you're not just making personal decisions, you are participating in the greatest experiment in the history of the universe, the attempt of matter to understand itself and take conscious control of its own future. If Sagan's warning has moved you to think differently about your place in the cosmos and your responsibility as a conscious being in an extraordinary universe, then you've found your community here among fellow cosmic citizens working to ensure that his most terrifying prediction never comes to pass. Subscribe not just to stay informed, but to stay connected with others who understand that the choices we make in the next few decades will echo through cosmic time. Share in the comments what gives you hope that humanity might still develop the wisdom to match our power, what specific actions you think we need to take to avoid the fate Sagan feared, and how cosmic perspective changes your own daily choices and priorities. The future of consciousness in this universe may depend on enough people taking these questions seriously and acting on the answers with the urgency that our cosmic situation demands.